Thank you for coming today. Appreciate it. Let me adjust this. It's a good turnout. We have a lot of people who didn't come because they're worried about the storm tomorrow, but we're in good shape, so ready for a good discussion. Before we get going, I want to thank the Global Perspectives teams. We have a number of interns and fellows who've really done a lot of work. If you guys could stand up for a second. Or someone tell them they're outside still. We're still having them work. But they do a great job. They had a great discussion this morning with Ambassador and Mrs. Welch, and we really appreciate their contribution. Also wanted to thank Mervat El-Jurdi, who really put everything together today. So thank you, Mervat. It's my honor, first of all, to introduce our supporters and friends, Ambassador Bobby Mandel and Jonathan Wolf, who are both benefactors of UCF Global Perspectives program, and not only benefactors, there's so much more, they're friends and allies, and have really helped us utilize their connections to make some of these really important events happen. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan and Bobby, who will introduce our guest of honor.
Well, thank you, David, and I'm certainly appreciative for all of you coming out today. And I want to give you the real reason why we're here today. If you look around, your future spouse may be here if you join the Foreign Service. Gretchen and David Welch, the real story is they met together during their tenancy in the Foreign Service in Pakistan, and there's a whole backstory on that. But each of them have served over 32 years of giving public service within the State Department. Gretchen had a distinguished career in many, many areas, including finally coordinating for the U.S. in London during the Olympics there in 2012. Ambassador Welch holds the title of Career Ambassador, which is equivalency of a 4-star general. But during his career in Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Washington, he also had some periods of serving on in the White House. And David, you'll correct me if I miss some of this. But under President George Bush I, National Security Council, 41, and on Bush 43, was the Undersecretary of State for the Near East in Iran. You know, the world's a troubled place. It's a complicated place, as we all know. Indochina, or the Indo-Pacific area, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and the Middle East to top it all off. No longer do we just simply have nation states that are battling for one ideology or another idea, but we also have non-nation states acting as nation states, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Houthis, and that further just complicates any ability to reach a peaceful settlement. And Ambassador Welch can enlighten us with some ideas as to how to get there. But Ambassador Mandel can tell us a bit more about what it really means to be running the State Department for the Near East and how important that is.
Thank you, Jonathan. You know, as a European ambassador, it was a tremendous honor to represent the President of the United States and the United States for the 4 years that I was overseas. But I must tell you that the people that were the very most respected ambassadors at the State Department were the Arabists. And those were actually people that spoke Arabic, but more importantly, they represented the United States and Arab countries that were either hostile or were difficult. That was probably a good way to describe those guys. And David Welch was the master at that. I mean, he is certainly one of the most respected ambassadors that's ever gone through the State Department, and he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, which is the top of the food chain for the Near East. And I will tell you that his knowledge base, his experience, all of the things that he's accomplished in his life have been worthy of have you guys spending some time listening to him today about what it is that he has learned and what his opinions are on things, because really the White House actually listens to his opinion on items. So for you all to spend a little time with Ambassador Welch today, I think it'll be worth your while, and I think you'll find it to be very enjoyable. With that, Ambassador Welch, please come up and...
Should I use this? I think I'm going to have to. So thank you, guys. I'm recovering from a cold that I caught from my grandkids, who have the best BW capability in America. So forgive me if every now and then I take a sip of water. I've been in front of a microphone before. So are you running the sound back there? Can you just pump it up a little bit, compensate for the weakness of my voice, and avoid my wife prompting me every now and then? So, Jonathan, Bobby, thank you to the Wolfs for inviting Gretchen and I here. You proceeded about that invitation the right way, because you brought her here first. She's the more important part of the family. Bobby, thank you for your kind remarks. You did exaggerate. You know, in the State Department, the truth is, not too many people want to go to some of the places that Gretchen and I have been. So, you know, we ended up there because we were not competitive and didn't dress well enough to go to Europe. You know, but it was a great career, and I look forward to, in the next few minutes, sharing a little bit about that with you all. Thank you for the weather, giving us a break every now and then this afternoon, and thank you all for braving it. But most of all, thank you to UCF for hosting this, bringing some of you together. I'm impressed that people are interested. It makes me feel better, frankly, that there is a community, a university community like this, that looks outward, that has people who are engaged and interested. That's a big part of our mission in life, is to grow that interest. And as you'll hear in a moment from me, I think it's critically important in our country. You know, I'm also here to help colleagues at the Partnership for Secure America, which is a little NGO that Gretchen and I support. It tries to encourage bipartisanship in Congress and between Congress and the administration's executive offices in national security affairs. Because, of course, I don't need to tell you all that you know, bipartisanship is kind of in short supply. But traditionally, foreign policy has been an area where Democrats and Republicans and independents could come together to do what's best for our country. And I believe that that's something that should be promoted. Abraham Lincoln once said that, and I'll quote one of our most important presidents, "There are few things wholly evil or wholly good. Almost everything, especially of government policy, is an inseparable compound of the two, so that our best judgment of the preponderance between them is continually demanded." In other words, the argument of the other is always something you should consider and listen to. And I think that lesson applies today even more than before. The need for bipartisanship in national security has never been greater. We do face unique challenges. This is a very troubling moment. We wouldn't have expected that just a few years ago. But today we are where we are. Think of America's national security as like a three-legged stool. The stool rests on these three legs. One leg is the transatlantic relationship, an area that, when he was ambassador, Bobby Mandel devoted himself to, principally NATO and the European Union. The second leg is Asia, particularly Xi Jinping's China. Third is the Middle East. And, once again, the Middle East has come back to remind us every single hour that passes of its relevance, its importance, and its dangers, and its opportunities. Today, as I said, we have what we would not have foreseen just a couple years ago. We have a war in the heart of Europe, and we have a war in the heart of the Middle East. And the war in the Middle East is connected to the one in Europe. I'll come back to that in a moment. At home, these conflicts split our political parties. The Republicans have been split on Ukraine. The Democrats have been split on Gaza. Some part of each party, though, unites in the middle. And that is the area where we have to concentrate. Some words on the Middle East. I am a State Department Arabist. For some people, that is a bad label. For me, it was always an inadequate one because my Arabic is not all that great. I do speak a few words, but Mirvat, who's here, would tell you, nah, the guy's not fluent. And also, I visited almost every country I could in the area of my responsibility. I've never been to Iran, though, which is, of course, not an Arab country, and it's not Arabic-speaking. But I couldn't go to Iran for obvious reasons, and I won't be able to travel there, I expect, for quite some time. And though I never served in Israel, I've been to Israel many multiples the times I've been to any other Arab country. I think I've been to Israel probably nearly 70 times. And why was that? Of course, because the heart of the conflict has generally revolved around Israel. Let's speak about that for a second. There was another October surprise. If we roll back to 50 years ago, or even to October 6, 2023. That was the 50th anniversary of the October 6, 73 war between Israel and Egypt. In the 50 years until October 6 of last year, until today, there has been no state-on-state Arab-Israeli war. You, of course, think of the areas full of conflict, and it has been. What happened after October 73? The United States led with nearly a decade of peace building and then peacemaking. And that peace has held for nearly 51 years, and we're still counting. But the October 2023 shock showed the reality that that conflict didn't go away. It had just changed. For the previous 50 years, all of Israel's wars, and there have been several, many, a fair part of the internecine conflicts in the region, and a lot of our own battles, America's fights, have been with non-state actors. These militias, they represent causes, or they dominate weak states, or both. They are a growing, not a receding menace. Hamas, of course, in the Palestinian areas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Houthis, as Americans say, Iranian allied militias in Iraq, Daesh, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and other places now. I'm not even mentioning Sudan and Libya, or the Sahel, or even Mozambique, where ISIS, believe it or not, is present. There's also another part of the background here, another menacing connection. Today there is a Russia, North Korea, Iran axis, and it has a Chinese cheerleader. North Korea and Iran export significant military systems that fuel these conflicts, in both cases to parties in the Middle East, and unusually and disturbingly to Russia to use in Ukraine. On Iran, our national security establishment, both Republican and Democrat, has not developed an effective Iran policy. A policy or an action here or there may have helped, but the Islamic Republic of Iran's three Hydra heads, terrorism and irredentism, missiles, and nuclear capability, have grown back. They're obvious today more than ever. This, of course, sounds sobering, and it's meant to be. We don't face these threats alone. We have friends. America's not without resources. You all are actually a resource. In Europe, NATO's stronger today than it's been in a long time. Defense budgets within NATO are rising. It could be better, but they're going up, not down. Sweden and Finland, who are authentically capable countries and always maintain their neutrality in that system, are now members of NATO. You know, if I were Russian sitting in Moscow, I'm not sitting in Moscow and I'm not Russian, I'm definitely not Vladimir Putin. But having Sweden and Finland in NATO is not a good thing for Putin's Russia. In China, Xi Jinping's nationalism, his sense of what he thinks China's role in the world should be, has caused a reaction from his neighbors. In that reaction, there's opportunity and resources for us. It's no surprise that some of the countries in Asia have turned more to the United States as this concern has risen among them. A very good example of that, by the way, is Vietnam. And think about our history with Vietnam. And today, we have, in the Middle East, a similar situation. More Arab countries have peace with Israel. Gretchen and I grew up in the Foreign Service where, for the better part of our career, that was just limited to Egypt. Then it expanded in the 90s to Jordan. Now it's grown more. Like Lincoln, leaders in these places found more good than bad in making those decisions. And they were able to balance them and stick with them. And remember that just 4 years ago, you know, sometimes Americans, we forget our history and we forget our anniversaries. But 4 years ago, just 4 years ago, two more Arab countries signed peace with Israel, Bahrain and the UAE. Further normalization is paused because of Gaza. And I'm not here to tell you that it's going to go further fast, but peace has not been reversed. That is a fundamental strength. And so far, neither has normalization. It may be paused, but it is not in reverse gear. Honestly, I believe when I look at the current situation, I think the most troubling picture for me is within Israel and within Palestine. Why do I say that? Because I don't think either side right now is united for a platform for peace that is acceptable not only within their own side, but between each other. There's no common agenda, really. Instead, if you measure public opinion polling, and I know every American is doing that every day these days, public opinion polling in Israel suggests strong support for fighting on against Hamas and Hezbollah. and little support, even declining support for Palestinian statehood. Public opinion polling in the Palestinian community suggests the inverse, not surprisingly, strong support for militancy and little support for negotiations. I truly wish I could be more positive about this moment, but I was brought up in the realist school of foreign policy, and optimism has its perils, has its values too. And unfortunately, negativism and cynicism is always rewarded. But personally, these worries reinforce my belief that you can't tackle any of this panorama that I've given you without greater unity, common purpose, and education about our national security. A couple of my friends in the front row undoubtedly know former Congresswoman Jane Harman. She chaired a commission on national defense strategy recently, bipartisan commission, and their headline point was the following, ladies and gentlemen. They said that, quote, "The American public have been inadequately informed by government leaders of the threats to U.S. interests and what will be required to restore American global power and leadership." In 2025, it won't matter who is elected here in the U.S. in November. In 2025, none of the three big issues I mentioned is going to change. They're all going to be there, and whoever's the American president is going to have to deal with them. To repeat, the three legs of the tripod, what are they? China and Asia, our transatlantic relationship, and yes, the Middle East. You know, when I was in the Foreign Service, as my career attests, I banged my head on these issues for a long time. I do believe that we all can, too. And in our retirement, Gretchen and I are trying in our own way to help in that respect. That's, you know, why I think it's pretty cool I get to come to UCF and talk to you all. And that's why I like what you embarked on here with your Global Initiatives program, but most of them all with education of people to be engaged Americans and engaged citizens in our world overseas. And you've built really quite a university here. I hope, by the way, you beat Colorado, and the game is not. I mean, I just say that because I got a daughter who lives in Denver, and we're all quite amused by Coach Dion, and I'd like to see his butt kicked a little bit. But Knights, right? Okay. I don't even know their name. But I want to commend UCF's interest in America's internationalism. And I want to encourage the younger people in this audience to cultivate an interest in public service. If you're 18 or over, begin by voting, but stick with it. This, I think, is the only way that we can, over time, build the kind of public support and involvement that our country will need to reverse what Jane Harman said, to demand of our government that they do more and be accountable to the American people for more successfully addressing the challenges our country faces. So that's my message. I've given versions of it over the last day or so, and my wife, who's a relentless critic, constructive one though, has told me I got to have something more uplifting to say. I wish I did, you know, but we've got a hurricane coming and one overseas too, so that's what I had to say to you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we can entertain some questions if we have time for that. Thank you for listening to me.
So we will have a moderated discussion, And we had a number of very good questions who were pre-submitted by students, and we appreciate that. And they kind of fall along three lines. One is policy issues. One is kind of history that you've seen. And one is more of a personal nature, and this is kind of the career advice you were just talking about public service. And I'm going to base this also because I've had the benefit of hearing you now several times talk, all good each time. But one point you made earlier about the Iraq War, you were when it started, the latest Iraq War, I guess, under George W. Bush, you were ambassador to Egypt. So you're in the largest Arab country in the world, and the U.S. is about to launch a war which you knew was going to be very unpopular in that country as well as throughout the region. And then you became later Assistant Secretary of State while the war was still going on. As a diplomat, you have your own opinions based on your experience and your read of the situation. You also have the duty you have as a representative of the United States government, which at the time was headed by President Bush. Have you had, throughout your career, times where you've had to reconcile your personal opinions, even strong ones, that may have gone against what the White House was saying?
Well, David, thank you for asking yet another good question. And asking it about the past, because I really don't want to second guess our current team on what they're doing, even though I have lots of advice where I asked. Look, we were in the Foreign Service. We took an oath to support our country's Constitution. I take that oath to the nation, not to an individual. I believe that our country should be run by its political leaders who are elected. I was selected, I wasn't elected. The presidents I worked for, the secretaries of state I worked for, also represented our people's interests. I felt my duty was to execute the policy. I enjoyed for a period of time a role in forming that policy. So in executing it, that means I had to face our foreign colleagues. And there, I hit them with everything I had, even if it was a bad argument. I hope you all would expect that of us, regardless of who I was representing. But when I turned around and the doors were closed and we were discussing these matters internally, I felt it was the obligation of our leadership to hear whatever advice I had to offer. Some of it positive, and yes, some of it negative. Some people were willing to listen more than others. Our politicians are humans, but at the end of the day, they have to make those decisions. So I felt that, they got to hear what I think is going to work and what's not going to work. Happily, most listened. I admit I was on the losing end of several arguments. The biggest problem for us as a business in the Foreign Service, and the Foreign Service, by the way, is a professional diplomatic corps. We need such a thing in our country. Just like we have to have a very professional military, we need a professional diplomatic service. Ambassador Mandel has done a lot to encourage that. And, that means that you actually have to be serious about this. You cannot be taken for granted one way or the other by the client, who's a foreigner sitting on the other side of the table, or by your own government. I guess I did okay in that, but then again, look at the mess that the Middle East is. So you can blame me for some of that, not all of it.
Well, you have a situation, I'm referring to Iraq and your time in Egypt, although you had other ones. You've met with a lot of leaders that didn't agree with you.
Yes.
But
almost all of them.
Almost all of them. But it doesn't necessarily mean you had a bad relationship with them, even on issues that were very serious and disagreed. So I bring up Iraq. At the time, Hosni Mubarak had been a president for 20 years and been a pretty reliable American ally, had sent troops, Egyptian troops, to fight alongside Americans in the first Gulf War, but he opposed this Gulf War. How do you deliver that message?
To him or his message to us?
To him.
Well, he heard the arguments from everybody, from the president on down, and directly. He just didn't agree. And to be honest, David, he's more right than not about some of the collateral consequences of our intervention after 2003, consequences that are still playing out today. And he had ample opportunity to express that, both publicly and privately. But at the end of the day, because he was a loyal friend of America, he made some compromises too. He found some good to work with in that balance of things, where he saw actually more bad, if you asked him. For example, we based U.S. Refueling and other logistics aircraft in Egypt during that war. For example, they expedited canal passage for American warships, overflight permissions. There was never a single problem with any of that. You need friends like that.
So I wanted to ask a question that came up earlier when you were meeting with interns and some of the leaders of our student groups that are internationally oriented.
Some of whom are here today.
Some of whom are here today, but it bears repeating as we have a lot more students here, many of whom are interested in pursuing a career in the Foreign Service or USAID or CIA or other agencies of the government, but don't know how to get started. You know, we go to a large regional university. We're in Florida. We're not in Washington. We don't come from a family that is familiar with the diplomatic corps, anything of that. What do you recommend to young people to get started?
Well, my goodness, Gretchen used to try to recruit for the Foreign Service, so you should ask her these questions. To those of you who are contemplating careers in public service, and by public service, I mean everything from what you just asked me about, the national security establishment, to the military, to the police, to the fire departments, to being a school teacher. Two of my daughters are not in public service, but the third is a clinical psychologist. I consider that public service. So please, look at this as a spectrum of possibilities. And now there's so many more in the international field in particular, businesses, NGOs, universities. But I think the most important thing is to have that interest, to expect it of yourselves as responsible citizens, that this is something that you need to learn about. And possibly if you're pulled that way out of patriotism, out of interest, to try and work in those areas, and then just take a stab at it, get started. I had lived in a number of places, but I'd never worked on the Middle East, and I spoke Spanish, not Arabic, when I entered the Foreign Service. But I always kind of wanted to do something in the Middle East. I thought it was really cool. I was motivated because, I don't know, I thought in conflict there's opportunity. I could get promoted faster if I did my work well.
Careers.state.gov and CIA. Just go to the websites.
Yeah, go to the websites. You can apply. Some of them will follow up more energetically than others.
I think everybody does.
Oh, okay. Always positive, my spouse.
There you go. Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to go spice a question that was asked in advance with another comment. You had mentioned, and we talked about this earlier today too, when you joined the diplomatic corps, President Carter was in office, and he was something of a disruptor in foreign policy. Yes. He took some real gambles on Camp David. Everyone remembers. People may not remember as vividly. The Panama Canal Treaty was very divisive political issue with big domestic political implications. Do we need more leaders that are willing to take some gambles, even if it's going to ruffle feathers and perhaps damage them domestically?
Well, we did have one president who is, if not anything else, a disruptor recently. And should he be elected again, I believe that trend will continue. How was that for a diplomatic answer?
Well, we don't know who you're talking about, but we'll continue.
honestly, right now we do need a little disruption. Some of the formulas tried by the current administration at the beginning of their time were pretty straightforward in their eyes, but haven't worked out so well. And I think that's caused them some issues. So I would expect that if Vice President Harris is elected, when she takes office on January 20th, she's going to be looking at that tripod and saying, what do I need to change here? I'm confident her political adversary, if he's elected, is definitely going to try to change some things. Fresh thinking is not bad. Conventional thinking can trap you. And we need to re-examine a lot of our national security formulas. We have just, grosso modo, we've overinvested in military solutions and underinvested in negotiated diplomatic solutions. Our national security establishment respects that distribution of effort and has rewarded it with bigger budgets on one side and atrophied budgets on the other. Those are things that need to be changed. And we should just apply a good old American sense of pragmatism to how to go about it. What has worked? What has not? What's been effective? What hadn't been effective? And, look, regardless of my political views, they are unimportant in this context. I think that this is a pretty simple calculation, and I think we can expect it to be made by whoever is elected in November and takes office in January. In the meantime, let's not forget, we have big problems that are happening every day, and the people who are causing those problems for our country, they're not waiting to January 20th for us to make the right decision. They're at work right now. And that's causing immense heartache in certain places.
So a couple questions based on what you just said and the questions submitted. Several variations of what are United States interests in the Middle East today and going forward. But before we get there, the other comment is, since World War II, we had the goals of keeping the free flow of energy, keeping the international commerce transit lanes open, and preventing large state-to-state wars, which you referred to earlier. And to do this, of course, since '73 especially, we've increased military assistance, particularly to Israel, Egypt, and Jordan over that time. Is that policy dated? Can we still do that, or do we need to adapt a new approach?
Well, we need adaptations of those policies. We need some new approaches. We need to rethink some of the old ones. For example, on the ensuring access to the hydrocarbon resources of an oil-rich area, we're big players in the oil market now, the United States is. In fact, we produce as much oil as the biggest of the OPEC producers. But we still have a big interest in the market, not necessarily the region as the first thing when it comes to oil. The market will affect us. The price of gas affects our politics, and we're a producer state, too. The deployment of military resources, I think, is an area that needs to be both disrupted and rethought. We have a Navy that is supposed to command the seas, but presently does not really command the seas in the Middle East. That a bunch of ragtag militants in Yemen can raise the price of insurance for Suez Canal passage, cause the diversion of cargo ships around the Cape instead of through the canal, and can still shoot, as we speak today, at maritime transit in the Bab el-Mandeb, is, that they have command of the seas. We do not. But last time I checked, we got a far better Navy, depending on how you define our Navy. So, there's some things need to be rethought here. I would not give up on the central propositions you listed at the beginning, which are security, stability, prosperity, change. And we do want to negotiate peaceful settlements to these conflicts, but that is not going to come unless we are able to deal with the real threat that is hitting us every single day right now. You have to have incentive to get to results, but you also have to, yes, I'm afraid, coerce results. Sometimes that can be done peacefully, sometimes it cannot. We have a big problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and as I said, we have no policy right now. It is not clear to me what our policy is.
Well, you just kind of dangled it out there, so I have to follow up on that. What should the policy be? And you know, thinking about it and talking about it earlier, we kind of talked about there's at least 3 tracks to approach Iran. One is to push for regime change. One is to isolate Iran, which we've essentially done with sanctions since the Islamic Republic came into being. And the third would be to kind of negotiate something like JCPOA to at least contain the nuclear threat. Which approach should we take, or none of the above?
So I would kind of meld them together, David. We need a policy that's going to address the 3 heads of the Hydra: missiles, nuclear ambition, and terrorism and irredentism. What we've got to do is convince those in Tehran who are calling the shots that there's more good for their country in stopping what they're doing. But if they don't stop it, there's got to be a lot of bad heaped on them. Right now, we are shy about increasing the costs. That presents great risk for us.
So when I just mentioned regime change, and you, of course, were in the region or working as Assistant Secretary of State on the region.
Notice I did not say regime change.
I know. I noticed you didn't, but I'm going to still try to prod it out of you. But that was the stated preference of some people in the George W. Bush administration. And again, hindsight is 20/20, so I'm not making a judgment on their actions at the time. But is that policy ever advisable, especially if you're pushing? I mean, there's an instance of a Saddam Hussein who different degrees of threat coming from him, or Iran, but there's also countries such as Egypt, where you were serving as our ambassador, where some were pushing for reforms that the Egyptian government at the time said, well, these are going to threaten our stability. And ultimately, Mubarak did fall to a crowd. Where is regime change of any kind, or democracy promotion, are those advisable, or those carry risks where you just don't know what the consequences will be?
Well, you always want to look at the risks you can identify and the ones that you sometimes can't identify. There's a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns in this. You're
channeling Donald Rumsfeld right?
It's about the only time I'm going to do it also. Look, personally, my own experience with what some would lump into the category of regime change is not a good one. I mean, it's just not on balance worked out well. That's not because the targets were not odious characters, the regime was not terrible. It's more because it just didn't work, and some of the unintended consequences have been very considerable. I mean, I did a lot of work on Libya, for example, and I can't tell you that I found Muammar Gaddafi to be, a very charming or engaging character. He was a reptilian individual, and but the unintended consequences of his overthrow have been, very considerable. They did not, actually, the loss to the Libyan people afterwards was greater than the loss before. The flow of migrants across the Mediterranean has destabilized European governments, including EU members. And today, this illegal migration problem is not just a problem in our country, it's a problem across Europe. And look at the political consequences of that. You know, these things people were not looking at them in 2011, excuse me, but we're sure looking at them today. And, you know, history doesn't stop just because we declared that we won something.
You just mentioned Libya, and of course, Gaddafi did fall. The U.S. got involved, one degree or another. A lot would say that was a mistake, how they got involved. But you also talked earlier about Syria and what the U.S. didn't do there. So again, we're going back in time, and we're not questioning the motives necessarily, the decision makers at the time, but we can assess at this point, what should the U.S. have done with Syria? We're now entering 13, 14 years of civil war. U.S. military personnel are deployed in Syria, Turkish armies in Syria. You have different militias. There's no sign of stability in a unified Syrian state anytime on the horizon.
Well, David is asking this question, ladies and gentlemen, because in 2011, you know, it is plausible that our decision makers faced, I wasn't in government at the time, I was working in private business, that they faced a scenario where they could decide, you know, where are America's resources and political will best exercised? And they chose Libya. They did kind of sort of intervene in Syria, but it was a kind of sort of thing. And then they decided it was too much. But Syria offered a strategic opportunity in the following sense. The penetration of the Islamic Republic of Iran into the Arab heartland goes mainly to those countries that have a Shia majority or a Shia plurality. And really, there are only 3 of those well, 4, I guess, if you count the Houthis in Yemen. Bahrain is a Shia majority country. Iraq is a Shia majority country. Lebanon is a Shia plurality country. Syria is one of the most heterogeneous places in the Middle East. But Iran, since 1979, and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, have exercised their influence through Syria, who's been, for them, a natural ally. So all the weapons to Hezbollah flow through Syria. Well, some come by sea, but most go through Syria. Take the flip side of that question. The Russians and Iran were willing to intervene in Syria on the side of the Assad regime against those who were fighting against him, his own people. And they were willing to exercise a level of coercion, of brutality, that I don't think we would be comfortable doing. Syria would be an extremely difficult exercise. And, you know, this is one place where I'm careful about second guessing. I do have that feeling it would have been a better strategic choice, but I don't want to underrate the risk here. It would have also been very risky. And the Russians were, you know, they've shown a lot better determination than we have. But these are people, by the way, who, you know, you can see what they're doing to Ukraine. They did it before in Grozny in Chechnya, and they have done it again in Syria. And they're trying other places in Africa, too.
So one question that came up was on energy, and you're familiar with the energy sector and regional policy and the overlap therein. And the question is, how has the U.S. increase in production through fracking and other ways in the last 10 to 15 years changed our political relationships in the Middle East region?
Well, you know, I thought initially that it might change it a lot, but some of the old truths have reasserted themselves, and so the security and stability part of the equation and the, you know, are different than the economics. We still do import petroleum and petroleum products from the Middle East, but a lot less than before. But it's a global market, and the global market does affect our livelihoods. You know, it's not just the price of gas, by the way. Your position on fracking might cost you a vote or two in places in the United States. But, you know, I've always thought it was a bit risky of presidents to ask, you know, the oil producers to, you know, pay attention to our politics when it comes to gas prices. By the way, both Republicans and Democrats have done that, so I'm not pointing fingers here. First of all, I think that's a bit unseemly for presidents to do. I think all they need to do is just like say, read the newspapers, dude. You know, this has an effect on me. We shouldn't ask that kind of thing. By contrast, it is certainly true that the OPEC producers in particular pay enormous attention to what Russia does. And of course, they pay attention to what Iran does too. And they're competing, oddly, for some of the same markets right now. And it's not a bad thing where we should disturb those relationships, by the way. We need to crack down a little bit harder on Russian exports. And we should. It's very hard to crack down on the Iranian ones, but we know who their consumers are. And the behavior of China on the one hand, and India, by the way, is considerably different than that of South Korea. South Korea sequesters all its money instead of paying the Iranians on anything. The others don't behave as nicely.
Well, sticking in the economic realm, obviously before 9/11, a lot of the focus of the Clinton administration, it was based, of course, on the Bush 41's policies, was to expand trade in the Middle East and strengthen trade relationships. So the slogan at the time was trade, not aid. If you had to be on the front lines of that. Now you have so many failed or failing states in the region. What role does trade and free trade and kind of expanded economic ties have in stabilizing the region, or can you even have that discussion with things as they are?
Well, the United States still remains the most natural business partner for almost any developing nation, and I include all the ones in the Middle East in that respect. And this is both an opportunity and a strength for us. Our capital markets are places to which everybody turns. Our tech investments are of interest to everyone, and an increasing area of collaboration and interest with certain Arab countries and Israel. And they have interests between them of a similar sort. There's been a lot of trade between the UAE and Israel after the signing of the Abraham Accords, for example. So I'm actually not that worried about this. But if you just do the math, these are not major trading relationships for the United States. We do have, by the way, free trade agreements with some of these countries. But those have not produced additional trade. It's quite unlike the situation with Canada and Mexico. And, if you took even the biggest of the trade relationships we have in the region, those would be with the Gulf oil producers in Israel. They're small in comparison to the major ones with Europe. I don't know if people in the audience even realize this, but traditionally, these have been, the trade balance would be negative between us and Saudi Arabia, for example. But the trade balance between us and Egypt is positive. We export more to Egypt than we import from it. And interestingly, the trade balance between the United States and the United Arab Emirates is also positive because we don't import that much oil and gas from them. But they buy a lot of aircraft and military equipment, technology now. But, we should look at it, and I've been trying to encourage this subtly, look at it from their point of view, too. So, does anyone in this room know who the UAE's biggest trading relationship is with? You might guess China. You'd be close to it. They may be number one. If they're not number one, they're number two. But number one or number two is India. And so they look east just as much as they look west. So when we're being critical of them for whatever misbehavior they're doing, these are our friends, so we can offer constructive criticism like Gretchen does for me. We need to bear that in mind. They look at their national interests and they balance it out slightly differently.
So questions about Saudi Arabia. What is Saudi Arabia's role in the future? You have dynamic economic and social reforms, to a certain degree, going on inside the kingdom. You have, under MBS, you have more diversified diplomatic and trade relationships. You have, obviously, a long flirtation with a possible peace agreement with Israel. What is the role for Saudi Arabia going forward?
In my professional lifetime, the epicenter of Arab politics has moved from Egypt to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. Saudi Arabia is the big player in the region. It is a very important player globally. Today, under the leadership of the Crown Prince, and I'm not being a cheerleader here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just telling you what we know from speaking to Arabs, Saudis, and others. Under the leadership of this Crown Prince, they are set on a different course. It's a very different country than our own, and it's never going to look like us. But he has real ambitions for change, and he's doing it. Mohammed bin Salman is astonishingly popular with everybody under the age of 40 in Saudi Arabia. And there's a reason for that, because they look at him and they say, wow, this guy he's not doing what his dad did. But it is still Saudi Arabia. The kingdom is not interested in fighting Israel, not at all. They are interested in normalization with Israel, not without conditions. And the conditions are not unreasonable. I wouldn't expect them to advance that really rapidly, given the situation right now, but it's intriguing that they've not pulled it back. They've said, we expect a Palestinian state. And then. But if they got enough in that category that was something they could take to the bank, boy, the and then would be just like that. And the Biden administration, like the Trump administration before it, was right to emphasize that course. I'm sorry it didn't pay off yet, but that's not something that they could totally control themselves. You know, our adversaries out there in the area knew it too, and that may have influenced their decision on when to pull their trigger.
You're right. The October 7th happened as discussions were picking up and they were getting reported widely. A question, of course, Israel and Saudi Arabia, you know, the saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So they've both share an enemy or perceived threat from Iran, which is a serious one for both of them. But you've seen Saudi Arabia do something different in the last year, which is restore relations with Tehran, because for one reason or another. What signal does that send? I mean, I say this because some would say, well, Riyadh decided Washington may not be on, you know, a course of confrontation with Iran. We have to have our own relations kind of manage things on a day-to-day level. What does that mean?
Well, you know, the Saudis have always had internal differences about how to handle Iran since 1979. But let's recall also that historically, the House of Saud, the ruling family of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia generally have been regional rivals, back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And that has influenced this internal debate in the kingdom, where sometimes they lean toward coexistence, and sometimes it was more directly adversarial. In the latter category, the Saudis, of course, have had to deal with the Houthis in Yemen, who were directly supported by the Iranians. Didn't work out so well for the Saudis, worked out even less well for the people of Yemen, but Iran didn't care about that. So I see them trying to strike this balance. And as they always look east anyways, and they're quite conscious of this historic Persian neighbor. They're right to experiment, I think. Now, of course, as an former American diplomat, I hope that comes with some conditionality and reservation. But we can influence that choice too, and that's a big part of the incentive category for how we deal with Iran in 2025 and from now on. Because I think, as I said, having good relationships with Saudi Arabia enables us to influence those kind of decisions. But that can also have a benefit in reinforcing security and stability in the Gulf, both to Saudi Arabia and to Iran. And since I'm not a big fan of trying to change the regime in Tehran, because I just think it's going to be a highly ineffective and costly way to do this, we need to change their thinking.
So you had mentioned earlier about Hezbollah and about the Houthis and proxies of Iran, and to a certain degree Hamas's as well. And these have been effective tools from Iran and pretty low cost relative to the response and the heavy military expenditure of Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, et cetera, in combating these.
Let me interrupt you there. I want to answer your question, but I want to say it's not at low cost to them. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been with us since 1979. How well is that country doing? How's it looking to you all? Is it an inspiring place of change? What did they invent recently other than trouble? Go ahead with your question.
Well, based on that, let me try to continue now. I mean low cost in terms of they're not actually doing the fighting, and they haven't had to put their country in battle since they were fighting Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So they're cautious of not expending their own forces. They're using proxies to do it. And relative to a full-scale state-to-state war, that is less costly, and that's where the question was coming from. How do you force change in Iran, though? Having a regime change type plan doesn't work. So I know those who are proponents of JCPOA, that's the Iranian nuclear deal, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym. The immediate goal was to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but further along perhaps was maybe that was the start of a path for some kind of a normalization down the road. How do you normalize relations with Iran or kind of encourage change when regime change isn't possible or necessarily desirable?
Well, I expect they're normal people. They've got a little group of folks sitting back there calling the shots for them, and they say there's good in this basket, there's bad in that basket. I want them thinking about those terms and on my terms. So, I wouldn't be trying to encourage anything. I would be showing them an opportunity and a cost. They've been told they have these opportunities for a while. They've either decided that those are not such great opportunities, or someone else is calling the shots in Tehran. The costs have been unevenly applied. So one American administration exhibits a policy of maximum pressure. Next one comes in, says we'll change that. One American administration says, just like you all, we have a long memory. And people who kill Americans, they'll be brought to justice one way or the other. We seem to be more interested in détente. We do not have détente today, ladies and gentlemen, with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're arming our adversaries. Our adversaries are attacking our friends. And that is a very, very troubling thing. Whatever was done before is not working. And I'm not second guessing anyone here. I'm just telling you, we got to start anew here, and for sure we're going to start anew. Doesn't matter what happens in our election in 2025. We're going to be working hard on this problem, because if we don't work hard on it, guess what? All the other problems are going to just persist.
You're just talking about Iran, but this can be applied to most policies. How much of a problem is it for the United States to have inconsistencies in these major policies, where you're going back and forth because other states will complain, how are we supposed to predict, you know, you elect Trump or you elect Harris, we're going to go 180 this way or 180 this way. It's just, it's a little chaotic. So is stability optimal for the U.S., and is that possible? How much is damaging is this?
Well, you know, we're not exactly a paragon of what you might call stability in comparison to what some others might call it. Actually, I think there is more bipartisan agreement on these matters than is projected publicly. As I said, the Republicans differ on Ukraine, the Democrats presently differ on Gaza, but some part of each party agrees on what's in the middle in both cases. That is the most important thing, is to grow that. And listen, I'm a big believer in American pragmatism. I think we work out empirically, at the end of the day, you know, what works. And I think we'll do a better job on this. I'm very, and if we don't, you know, of course, and if I'm wrong, we'll have these problems, and they'll persist. I do not think you know, it's good. It would be nice if we were nice, predictable people, and we were always dealing with predictable friends and enemies abroad. But that's just not the way history or things work. You know, it's also not in the American character. We enjoy a little bit of unpredictability, which even sometimes can be amusing.
Well, some of our unpredictability, though, also comes from non-state actors, and you've seen a number of them come in the Middle East in the last few decades. How does the State Department deal with this? For example, you're used to dealing with a government in Cairo. You're used to dealing with, you know, government in Amman, other places you've been posted. But you have a situation like Lebanon, for example, where you have a Lebanese government, but everyone knows that the kingmaker really in Lebanon is Hezbollah. And you can't have the Lebanese government agree to something without Hezbollah at least giving tacit support. How does the U.S. State Department deal with non-state actors?
Well, you know, we don't have a department of non-state actors. We're pretty cut and dried traditional diplomatic service. So let me answer only from my own experience. Secretary Rice and I negotiated UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which halted the fighting in 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel. That was a vehicle for us to restore security and stability along that border between Israel and Lebanon. And it's held until very recently. And it may, the UN component force of that may be a part of restoring security and stability in the coming period. But I didn't negotiate that with Hezbollah. I never met with Hezbollah. The only connection between me and Hezbollah were the banners they used to hang in the tunnels in Beirut and on the buildings saying, "Welch, go home." But they never targeted me personally, because I think they wanted a solution. Otherwise, they would have bombed the American embassy like they did before. They would have shot at David Welch, as they've shot at other American diplomats. We had intermediaries to them. I'm not giving away diplomatic secrets here. It was obvious. All you have to do is just, you know, if any of you are old enough to know what the calendar was back then, you could see who we were meeting with. And, you know, we knew what the address was. And we managed to change their calculation of good and bad. But remember, we were also not calling the shots for our Israeli friends. Israel is a democracy. It has a right to defend itself, and should. They were attacked. So, how they went about it, that was their decision. We were not lecturing them on that. We just knew that at some point they also would want to stop it. So that's what we did.
Of course, part of diplomacy is telling friends when they have made mistakes. And I know you had to do this in Egypt.
Quietly.
Quietly. Well, and not so quietly, which has not worked in some cases when you embarrass them. What are the lines? And I'm asking this question. We just mentioned Israel because Israel's gotten a lot of criticism for the way it's conducted its response, and the U.S. has gotten criticism for supporting Israel in turn. But it's not just Israel. This has happened again in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, et cetera.
Well, I mean, for me, one of the toughest was always what I'll call human rights cases. These would be people. David, you knew some of these people yourself. People would get arrested for, saying things or doing things that the regime, whatever regime it was, didn't like. They get thrown in jail.
Saad Ibrahim is your
Saad Ibrahim is exactly the example I'm thinking of. This is a gentleman who is a human rights advocate in Egypt, was arrested and imprisoned by Mubarak. And I used to visit him in jail. Saad was a gifted academic, a really nice, sweet man who was not a threat to the Mubarak regime or to his country at all. I used to take him The Economist magazine and stuff so he'd have something to read in Torah prison, and take him brownies that the ambassador's cook would make, and he would then turn right around and give to the policemen who were listening in on the conversation. And the point I would make to every senior Egyptian, Mubarak on down, is, why bother with this guy? Do you really think the benefit is worth the cost? And that was the main argument. It really didn't work. They released him only when, they decided to release him. Hectoring didn't produce much. That's what I tried. Now, that's not a big conflict case like this one. I want to be very, very careful in front of this audience, not to second guess the decisions and responsibilities of the current team on the American side dealing with this. Having been there, I know that this is like a menu of all things you wouldn't want to order. It's like no good options here. I would suggest doing it more quietly. I think being too public about such things does not improve your chances.
So I want to talk a little about peace and actually possibilities and opportunities. You, your first 10 years as Assistant Secretary of State, you oversaw UN policy, correct? You mentioned earlier about, military assistance and kind of, that we've only relied on a few things instead of all the options on the menu, if you will. Do we underutilize the UN?
Well, we have unreasonable expectations about what it can do, and I think that's going to be even more problematic in the immediate future, because now among the permanent members of the Security Council who have the veto right, the divisions are so stark and so deep that it's very hard to envision unified action. And that is the only executive authority with international legal credibility of the UN. General Assembly decisions have no legal effect, really. Security Council decisions do. And the EU in particular, as Ambassador Mandel would remind me, relies on Security Council mandated decisions to impose certain ones of EU decisions, such as imposition of sanctions. So, it's an instrument we need. And the UN can also provide support to us in the following sense. They're willing to do things we're not. We don't have relief personnel in Gaza today. So the UN is going to play some role there. And not all the UN employees working in Gaza are like Hamas people. Yes, some of them work. But somebody's going to have to administer aid in Gaza. I'd rather have the UN do it than certain other organizations, to be honest. Also, we pay 25% of the UN budget, more or less, give or take a number or two, as our obligation as a member. That means for every UN dollar that's spent, someone else is spending 75 cents. So there's certain missions that we want to undertake for political reasons that we don't want to do ourselves directly. The UN does those at lower cost to America. So I do think it has that value. There's a final important one, too, and it's harder to judge because we've had mixed results even as recently as yesterday. The UN is the only global platform for the expression of normative norms of the international community. So when an American president goes and opens the General Assembly every year since its foundation, he has a chance to speak to everybody and say, here's what we're about, here's why we want to do this. And he has a chance to gather moral authority, he or she, for their decisions. That's, some presidents have used that effectively, others have not. But if you watched yesterday, who spoke before and after Biden, they're all very conscious of that global podium. They're telling you why we think this about Ukraine, why we think this about Gaza, why we think this about climate. That the UN isn't going to come and steal your lawn furniture, folks. It's there. It can be a clarion voice for reason. And again, we should take better advantage of that.
So we've been talking a lot about the Middle East, of course, but the other big issue that's going on is obviously the war in Ukraine right now. I'd like you to comment a little on the importance of that to U.S. interests and what is a optimal outcome for the United States, considering that it is highly unlikely that Ukraine will be able to win back all their territory and that some kind of negotiated settlement is possible or likely as an end result.
When the most recent round of fighting started in Ukraine, I told friends that I thought that there were basically three things that we should try as the United States to do. By the way, I'm not a Ukraine expert, so don't pay any attention to this part of the conversation. Number one, reduce the damage to Ukraine to the extent we can. Number two, increase the damage to Russia as much as we can in a responsible way. And number three, make sure that whatever happens and the day after when that comes, that Vladimir Putin comes out of this looking worse. Number one and number two are certainly still underway. But it's troubling to me that number three isn't entirely clear already. There are about 140 countries in the world that took a silly position in the General Assembly votes on the Ukraine. That's the audience we have to influence. They have to understand and see that this is not the way that problems are going to be solved. And they haven't made that choice so far. Maybe we have been not doing a good job in getting them to understand what's at stake here. That's one that worries me the most. I I'd rather not speak about how to solve the problems. Honestly, I don't know. You know, this is a war that's still obviously raging, and I do think it's going to become a little more intense in the coming weeks.
So we just have a minute left, and I wanted to take the time, first of all, to recognize and thank John Sullivan for coming from Partnership for Secure America. You are the chairman of the board of that organization, and you mentioned earlier it promotes bipartisan foreign policy solutions. And John's been gracious enough to talk to faculty and students as well as be on TV, explaining some of the programs that are unique, and we certainly hope UCF can partner on some of those programs going forward. But the mission of a bipartisan foreign policy, a lot of the work is aimed at educating congressional staff how to work together on a bipartisan basis. You were a career diplomat, and I know other members of your board include military officers, business folks, and others. Why do you, who are not from the congressional side, see that bipartisanship as so critically important to American national security?
Because I think an educated citizenry that is involved in public policy through our branches of government with support and respect for each one of those is vital to our democracy. Look, you know, I had to represent the State Department in a number of different ways in front of Congress. By the way, the Bureau of International Organizations, which handles UN matters, where I was assistant secretary, actually has one of the biggest budgets in the State Department because UN peacekeeping dues and UN membership dues are so expensive. So I'd have to go up there every year and explain to members of Congress who are, unlike me, they were elected, not selected like I was, and you know, get them to defend these interests in front of people like yourselves who say ask for their votes. It was not always a comfortable discussion. And, you know, also when you work on the Middle East, boy, there's some people on one side of the aisle who are going to come after you on one thing, and the other people on the other side are going to come after you on the other. And sometimes you get hung out in the middle to dry. I was good at taking the shots. But look, honestly, an educated citizenry is the foundation of our republic. And you can do that in any number of ways. This enterprise that John is the executive director of, Partnership for Secure America, is, you know, very cost-effective organization, and it does something that is, I think, you know, I hope I learned a little bit about my professional and career, including in business, which is, at the heart of it, it's all about building relationships so that you find some common ground to get stuff done. And getting stuff done is like the most important thing. So that's why John signed me up. I didn't sign him up, by the way, to do this. And I have a couple of neighbors, too, who are board members. So, you know, one of them was a staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at one point. Another was an excellent State Department guy like me. And we just we believe in this. You know, and we have time on our hands. We can do it.
Well, on behalf of University of Central Florida and the Global Perspectives Program, we want to thank you for coming, first of all, and thank you, Gretchen Welch as well, and John Sullivan. And thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate it. And most importantly, thank you for your service to our country.